On the evening of Saturday the 5th of March 1966, a coffin was carried along the platform at Evercreech Junction. It was not a large coffin, and there was nothing inside it. A local florist had arranged the whole business, and he walked in front in a black coat and a tall hat, the way an undertaker walks. Behind him came the stationmaster, Alexander Stowe, and 3 of his staff in uniform, each of them wearing a purple ribbon. On the lid lay a cross made of yellow flowers. A card with a black border said that the Somerset and Dorset Railway had died that day, the 5th of March 1966. They loaded it into the guard's van of a passing special. Someone had rigged a loudspeaker in the booking office window, and music played out across the tracks while the crowd stood and listened. A few miles down the line, at Evercreech New, the coffin was taken off the train and put into a hearse. Nobody stopped them. There was nobody left with the authority to care. Evercreech Junction was a small place in the middle of Somerset, a set of platforms in flat farming country, where a branch line to the Bristol Channel met a main line running north to south. On an ordinary weekday, it handled milk churns, coal wagons, cattle, and a modest number of passengers who mostly knew the porters by name. On summer Saturdays, the same platforms watched express trains go through at speed, full of families from Manchester and Birmingham heading for the sea. That evening, it handled a funeral, and every person standing there understood exactly what was being buried. This is the story of the Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway, which ran from Bath Green Park to Bournemouth West, a little over 71 miles of single and double track laid across the wrong grain of the English countryside. Railwaymen called it the slow and dirty. They also called it, without much embarrassment, the finest railway in Britain to work on. It crossed the Mendip Hills at 811 feet above the sea. It needed 2 engines on almost every heavy train. It lost money for most of its life, and when it closed, it took the last railway out of a long list of country towns that have never had one since. The question worth asking is not whether the Somerset and Dorset made a profit. It plainly did not. The question is, why a route that carried tens of thousands of holidaymakers every summer, that fed milk and coal into the national system, and that kept working when the roads were shut, was written off as a duplicate, and why the ending was handled the way it was. To understand any of it, you have to go back to a bad idea that 2 small companies had in the 1850s. The Somerset Central Railway opened on the 28th of August 1854. It ran from Highbridge on the Bristol Channel coast inland to Glastonbury, and it was built to the broad gauge because the Bristol and Exeter Railway worked it. The ambition behind it was larger than the line itself. If you could join the Bristol Channel to the English Channel, you could take Welsh coal and Irish traffic across the neck of southern England and save ships the long, dangerous passage round Land's End. That was the plan. A pier was built out into the mud at Burnham, and steamers were to connect with Wales and with the Channel Islands. From the other end, the Dorset Central Railway pushed north from Wimborne, reaching Blandford in 1860. 2 small companies, one aiming south, one aiming north, both undercapitalised, both convinced there was money in the middle. They amalgamated in 1862 and became the Somerset and Dorset Railway, and by 1863 you could travel by train from the Bristol Channel to the south coast. Almost nobody did. The through traffic never appeared in the volumes the promoters had promised each other. The steamers were not a success. The pier at Burnham sat there in the estuary, useful mainly to people who wanted a walk. The company had built a railway from one place hardly anybody wanted to leave to another place hardly anybody wanted to reach, and it was in trouble within a decade. So in 1873, the directors did the one thing that could either save the company or finish it. They resolved to build north from Evercreech, across the Mendip Hills, through the Somerset coalfield, to a new station at Bath, where they could hand traffic to the Midland Railway and reach Birmingham, the industrial north, and Manchester. The Bath extension was 26 miles of the most difficult railway engineering in southern England. The line had to leave Bath and climb almost immediately, boring through Devonshire Tunnel and then Combe Down Tunnel, 1,829 yards of unlined rock with no ventilation shafts at all, the longest tunnel of its kind in Britain. Then out onto the Midford Valley on a viaduct, up past Radstock into the coalfield, and on up to the summit near Masbury at 811 feet, with long stretches at 1 in 50 on both sides of the top. 1 in 50 is severe for a main line. It means anything heavier than a short local train needs a second locomotive to get over the hill. It opened on the 20th of July 1874, and it cost about £400,000, which the company did not have. The Bath extension bankrupted the Somerset and Dorset within a year of opening. What happened next changed the character of the line permanently. In 1875, the ruined company was leased jointly by the Midland Railway and the London and South Western Railway for 999 years from the 1st of November. The Great Western Railway, which had assumed it would pick up the pieces and which regarded the whole of that part of Somerset as its own back garden, was reportedly furious, and the anger did not fade. From that point, the Somerset and Dorset was a foreign railway driven straight through Great Western territory, and there were people in the Western region who never forgot it. Keep that in mind, because it matters a great deal later. The Joint Committee ran the line from 1876. The Midlands supplied the locomotives, painted in a Prussian blue that became one of the most loved liveries in Britain. It was a small railway with an enormous personality, and it developed a workforce that stayed for life and then handed the job to a son. Highbridge was the heart of that. The works there built and repaired the line's own carriages and wagons, and for the little Somerset town, it was the largest employer for miles around. The London, Midland and Scottish closed it in 1930, taking several hundred jobs out of Highbridge in a single decision. That was the first amputation. The railway had 36 more years to run, but its independent life ended when the works shut. By the early 20th century, the line had found its purpose, and it was not the one the promoters had imagined. The through traffic never came from the sea, it came from the north. Bournemouth had grown from a handful of villas among the pines into one of the great English holiday resorts, and the shortest way to reach it from Manchester, Sheffield and Birmingham was down the Midland to Bath and then over the Mendips. The train that carried that traffic was the Pines Express. It ran from Manchester London Road to Bournemouth West, and it took its name from the pine trees of the Bournemouth chines. It reversed at Bath Green Park, under that beautiful curved iron train shed, and then it went at the hills. On a heavy summer Saturday, the Pines could load to 11 or 12 coaches, and 11 or 12 coaches over Masbury needed 2 engines and 2 crews who knew exactly what they were doing. That was the thing about the Somerset and Dorset. It could not be worked casually. The banks demanded a fireman who could keep a full head of steam for 40 minutes at a stretch, and a driver who knew every yard of the road in the dark and in fog. Bath Green Park's shed produced men like that for 80 years. They shared their engines, they knew each other's families, and they took a personal view of the timings. Ask anyone who worked there and you get the same answer, which is that it was hard, filthy, badly paid work, and that they would go back tomorrow. The line had its dark days too, and one of them came out of the tunnels. On the 20th of November 1929, a northbound goods train worked hard up through Combe Down Tunnel towards Bath. There was no ventilation in that tunnel, and on a still, damp day, the smoke and fumes had nowhere to go. The driver, Henry Jennings, and his fireman were both overcome by the fumes. The engine came out of the tunnel with nobody in control of it, ran away down the falling gradient into Bath, and crashed into the goods yard at Green Park. Jennings was killed, and so were 2 men working in the yard. The medical evidence at the inquiry recorded carbon monoxide saturation of 75% in the driver's blood. That was the price of building a railway through a hill without spending the money to ventilate it, and it was paid 55 years after the corner had been cut. The best years were the summers of the 1950s. On a Saturday in July or August, the line could see more than 20 extra trains beyond the normal timetable. Signalmen worked their boxes without a break for hours. At Evercreech Junction, at Templecombe, at Shepton Mallet, the platforms filled with people who had been on a train since 7 in the morning and could smell the sea coming. Those were the last good summers. Then came the winter, and the winter of 1962 into 1963 was the coldest in England since 1740. Snow began falling after Christmas and lay for months. Roads across the Mendips and through North Dorset filled to the tops of the hedges and stayed that way. Drifts built up in the cuttings, and locomotives fought through them until they could not. One train stalled at West Pennard, unable to move for the depth of the snow, and the passengers had to get out and walk onto Shepton Mallet. Across the west of England that winter, railways carried food, coal and fuel into towns that the lorries could not reach at all, because the railway was the only thing still moving. The point is not sentimental. The point is that in 1963, the Somerset and Dorset demonstrated in the clearest possible way what a railway was for, and it made no difference at all to what happened next, because 10 weeks after the thaw, the report was published. On the 27th of March 1963, Dr. Richard Beeching published The Reshaping of British Railways. He had been brought in from Imperial Chemical Industries in 1961 by the Minister of Transport, Ernest Marples, and given a straightforward instruction, which was to make the railway pay. His report proposed closing around 5,000 miles of route and more than 2,300 stations. The Somerset and Dorset was on the list. It is worth being fair to Beeching, because he was doing precisely the job he had been hired to do, but his survey counted passengers for 1 week in April 1961, which for a holiday line was close to the worst week of the year he could have chosen. And his arithmetic gave a route no credit for the traffic it fed into the rest of the system. The figures were not wrong, so much as narrow. What is harder to be fair about is what the Western region had already been doing to the line. In 1958, the Somerset and Dorset had been transferred to Western Region control. The Western Region was the direct descendant of the Great Western, the company that had watched the Midland and the South Western take this line in 1875, and it had its own routes to the south coast that it would rather fill. From that point, the S&D was steadily taken apart while everyone watched. The Pines Express went first. At the end of the summer timetable in 1962, the train was rerouted away from the Mendips and sent via Oxford and Basingstoke instead. The last Pines Express over the Somerset and Dorset ran on Saturday the 8th of September 1962, and British Railways sent 92/20 Evening Star to work it, the last steam locomotive the company ever built, only 2 years old. Enormous crowds turned out. The engine carried a headboard, the photographers lined the banks, and everyone knew that when the Pines went, the reason for the line's existence went with it. After that, the withdrawals came steadily. Freight facilities were taken away from the intermediate stations. Midford, Wellow and Chilcompton were reduced to unstaffed halts. The night freight and mail working ended on the 7th of September 1964, after generations of running. By the middle of 1965, the timetable was so thin that travelling the length of the line had become an exercise in patience, and the passenger figures obediently collapsed, which was then produced as evidence that nobody wanted the trains. There is a word for this in railway circles, and the word is not flattering. But it happened in the open, in front of local councils who complained about it in writing, and it worked. The objections came in volume, from the county councils, from the towns, from people who wrote letters to the Western Daily Press for 2 years. In September 1965, the Minister of Transport, Tom Fraser, gave his consent anyway. A Labour government had come in the previous October, promising to look again at the cuts, and for a great many people in Somerset and Dorset, that consent was the moment the promise broke. That December, Barbara Castle replaced Fraser at the ministry. She later did more for the railway than almost any minister of her era. She did not save the Somerset and Dorset. The machinery was already moving, and she let it move. Closure was set for Monday the 3rd of January 1966. Under the rules, a railway could not be closed until replacement bus services were in place, and this is where the ending became undignified. Days before closure, one of the bus operators withdrew its application for a licence. The replacement service did not exist. British Railways had a closure date and no legal way to use it, so the line was reprieved by accident, and for 9 weeks it ran what was officially called an emergency service. 2 or 3 trains a day, over a route that had once carried the Pines Express, calling at stations where the staff had already been transferred. Nobody was in any doubt that they were watching a railway serve out its notice. The last day of scheduled services was Saturday the 5th of March 1966. 2 farewell specials ran that day, and they carried far more people than the timetable trains had seen in years. The Locomotive Club of Great Britain tour was double-headed by 2 bullied Pacifics, 34006 Bude and 34057 Biggin Hill, working over the Mendips as pairs of engines had worked over them for 90 years. It ran badly late because of the crowds at every station and the sheer number of people who wanted to be on it or near it. Along the line, people came out to watch a train they were never going to see again. They stood on the bridges over the cuttings between Midsummer Norton and Chilcompton. They gathered at Binniger and Masbury and Shepton Mallet. Detonators had been laid on the rails, and they went off under the wheels like gunfire as the trains passed. At Bath, where the crowd waited on the platforms until nearly 20 to 11 at night for the special to come in, people held up torches in the dark and waved daffodils, because it was March and the daffodils were the only flowers there were. In the photographs from that night at Bath Green Park, a striking number of the faces belonged to children. Fathers had brought their sons down to see it. 1 more special ran on the Sunday, then it was over. On Monday the 7th of March, for the first morning since 1874, no train left Bath Green Park for the south. Bath Green Park shed closed with the line. Some of its men were found work at Bristol or Westbury, at the cost of a long daily journey. Some were near enough to retirement that they took it and never worked again. Drivers who had spent 30 years learning the road over the Mendips, who could tell you where they were in Combe Down Tunnel by the sound alone, found that the knowledge was now worth nothing to anybody. The figure usually quoted for the jobs that went is in the hundreds, and in towns the size of Highbridge and Radstock, that number lands hard. Then came the part that always follows, and that nobody photographs. The track was lifted with unusual speed. Within a couple of years, most of the Somerset and Dorset had gone from the ground entirely. A few fragments worked on. Basin Bridge Creamery kept its rail connection into the early 1970s, and goods trains reached Blandford Forum until 1969. Then those went too. Signal boxes were knocked down. Station buildings became houses and yards for builders' merchants. The rails went for scrap, and the ballast went into road foundations, which has a certain grim symmetry to it. Bath Green Park, that graceful train shed with its curved iron roof, sat empty and rotting for years, and was very nearly demolished. It survived because Sainsbury's built a supermarket behind it in the early 1980s, and restored the shed as part of the deal. It is listed now. You can park your car under the ironwork where the Pines Express reversed, and there is a small plaque, and most people walking past have no idea what they are standing in. The 2 tunnels sat sealed and dark for nearly 50 years. Then in 2013, they were reopened as a walking and cycling route, the 2 Tunnels Greenway, and Combe Down became the longest cycling tunnel in Britain. If you walk through it today, you will find it lit and dry and pleasant. And about halfway along, there is a point where the sound changes, and you can hear how much space is above you. Henry Jennings died in that tunnel in 1929, and there is nothing there to tell you so. South of the Mendips, the trackbed became the North Dorset Railway, running through Sturminster Newton and Shillingston and Blandford, on the formation where the Dorset Central Railway started in 1860. Shillingston Station has been restored by volunteers. Buildings, platform, signals and all, with track laid again in front of it. Midsummer Norton South Station has been brought back the same way, further north, on the Coalfield section. At both places, you can stand on a real Somerset and Dorset platform and look at a length of real S&D track, and then look at the end of it, where the railway stops. The towns took the worst of it, and it lasted. Shepton Mallet lost its second station and has had no railway since. Wincanton has had none. Sturminster Newton has had none. Blandford Forum, which is often described as the largest town in Dorset without a railway station, has had none since the goods train stopped in 1969. Everyone in those towns now drives because there has been nothing else to do for 60 years, and the roads that carry them were laid out for a country that had trains. So was it worth it? Take the case against the line honestly, because it is a real case. The Somerset and Dorset lost money, and had done for most of its existence. Its steep banks needed 2 engines where a flatter line needed 1. Its great traffic was seasonal, which meant paying all year for track, signalling and staff that earned their keep on about a dozen Saturdays. And there genuinely was another way from the Midlands to Bournemouth, through Oxford and Basingstoke, which is where the Pines went in 1962 and where it ran perfectly well afterwards. As a through route, the S&D really was a duplicate, and no amount of affection changes that. What the case leaves out is the local railway underneath the express. Once the through trains were gone, the S&D was still the only public transport across a wide stretch of Somerset and North Dorset. The closure did not remove a cost so much as move it onto the roads, onto the county councils, and onto every household that had to buy a car it could not really afford. There is one piece of evidence worth sitting with. Templecombe lost its station in 1966, along with everything else. Local people campaigned for years, and in 1983, British Rail reopened it as an experiment. It has been open ever since, and it carries far more passengers than anybody predicted. One station does not prove a 71-mile main line would have paid its way. It does suggest the people who said the demand was still there were not imagining it. If you walk the trailway south from Sturminster Newton on a wet morning in February, you can still read the line in the shape of the ground. The formation runs level and true through fields that rise and fall around it, because a railway will not tolerate the land's opinion, and a footpath does not care. There is a bridge abutment in the trees. There is a stretch where the hedges stand oddly far apart, and that is because they were planted along a boundary fence for a double track that is no longer there. In the cutting at Masbury, where the wind used to hit the firemen at 800 feet up, there is now nothing at all but gorse and the sound of the road. The last thing to say about the Somerset and Dorset is that its closure was not a disaster. Disasters are sudden. This took 8 years, and it was decided by reasonable people in offices with figures in front of them, each of whom could have explained perfectly why they had done what they did. The men at Bath Green Park Shed knew what was happening to their railway 2 years before the notices went up, and they went on cleaning the fires and booking on at 4 in the morning anyway, because there were still trains to run. Somebody watching this worked on that line, or had a father or a grandfather who did, and I would rather have your account of it than any book. Tell me which station you lost. It does not have to be on the Somerset and Dorset. Any of them, anywhere. The halt at the end of your village, the junction your mother travelled from, the platform that is somebody's garden now. Put the name in the comments and say what stands there today, because that list is the only part of the record still being written. The rails are gone from the Mendips. The cuttings are still there, holding their shape in the hill, waiting for something that is not coming back.